My name is Chelsea Parker, and I never thought the reading of my father's will would turn into one of the most humiliating, and later most satisfying, moments of my life. My father, Michael Parker, was a man who built his legacy from raw calluses and blueprints. He started Parker-Built Incorporated in his 20s, hauling concrete by day and sketching building designs on napkins by night. By the time I was born, he had turned a single-room office into a regional construction empire. He was the kind of man who shook hands with governors and still insisted on cleaning his own tools. Growing up, my older brother Ethan was his shadow. They shared the same spark, the same restless ambition that kept them awake long after the rest of us went to sleep. Dad used to say with a proud grin, "Ethan's got my drive." And he did, but what Dad never seemed to notice, what no one ever did, was that I had his heart. I had his way of seeing the world not in profits and blueprints, but in details, the way sunlight hit unfinished steel beams, or how the smell of sawdust could somehow feel like home. I was the artistic one. That's what they called me. Not smart, not hardworking, artistic. It was the family's polite way of saying different. When Dad passed, his death hit me like cold water. I had been living in a small studio apartment downtown, working freelance as an illustrator. I hadn't spoken to Ethan in nearly a year, not out of anger, but because every conversation with him ended in some variation of "you should get a real job, Chels." The morning of the will reading, I stood in front of the mirror trying to calm my nerves. My reflection stared back at me, 27, with tired eyes and a black dress that didn't quite fit right. I told myself I didn't care what I inherited. I just wanted to hear, in some form, that my father had seen me, that I mattered. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of old paper and burnt coffee. Dark wood panels lined the walls, and certificates hung in neat symmetry behind the desk. It felt sterile, like the kind of place where people came to measure worth in numbers. Ethan was already there when I arrived, lounging in a leather chair as if he owned the building. He looked sharp, tailored suit, hair perfectly combed back, wearing one of Dad's vintage Omega watches on his wrist. It glinted every time he moved, a small reminder of who the real heir was supposed to be. "Chelsea," he said, smirking as I walked in. "Didn't think you'd actually show. I figured our people don't wake up before noon." I ignored the jab and took a seat. His fiancée Lydia was there too. She was all polish, pearls, manicured nails, and a look that said she thought she was part of the Parker dynasty already. She smiled at me the way someone smiles at a stray cat, amused, but keeping distance. The lawyer, a gray-haired man named Mr. Walker, adjusted his glasses and shuffled his papers. "Thank you for coming. Your father's estate is fairly straightforward." Ethan leaned forward, practically vibrating with anticipation. Mr. Michael Parker's estate includes the family home, valued at $2.4 million, Parker-Built Incorporated, and several personal assets. Ethan shot Lydia a confident glance. "Let's get to it then." Walker cleared his throat. "Per your father's wishes, the family home and the company, Parker-Built Incorporated, will be transferred to Ethan Parker." Ethan's grin spread slowly, like a man savoring victory. He leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head. Guess Dad knew who could handle the heavy lifting. Lydia stifled a giggle behind her hand. I kept my expression calm, though my stomach twisted. I wasn't surprised. Maybe I'd even expected it. Still, some small, fragile part of me had hoped Dad might have seen more. "And to Chelsea Parker," Mr. Walker continued, "your father leaves a single item, the wooden box stored in his study." Silence. For one strange moment, no one moved. Then Ethan's laughter broke the stillness like a slap. "An old box? That's it." He turned to Lydia, nearly choking on his own amusement. "Guess Dad wanted her to have somewhere to store her crayons." Lydia laughed softly, almost apologetically, but didn't stop. Even Mr. Walker shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Heat climbed up my neck. I forced myself to smile, a small brittle thing, and said, "Thank you." My voice came out steady, though I could feel the tremor underneath. Ethan shook his head, still chuckling. "You know, Chels, Dad always said you saw beauty where others didn't. I guess this is his final test." I stood, straightened my skirt, and met his eyes. "Maybe it is." For a second, something flickered in his face, confusion, maybe discomfort, but it passed quickly. As I turned to leave, Lydia whispered something to him that made him laugh again. Their laughter followed me out of the office like an echo I couldn't shake. Outside, the winter air hit me hard. It smelled of exhaust and melting snow, of city grit and something sharp, like disappointment solidified into air. I walked down the steps clutching my bag, the lawyer's voice still replaying in my head. The wooden box stored in his study. A box. That was my inheritance. But somewhere deep down, beneath the humiliation, beneath the ache in my chest, something stirred. Because if there was one thing my father taught me, it was that nothing he did was ever without reason. And if he left me a box, then it wasn't just a box. Not from him. Not for me. The box sat between my crossed legs like a small, impossible altar. Up close, the oak grain looked like a map of years, rings and scars and a line where someone had once clumsily sanded the corner. The brass latch was dull with age. The key taped to the underside in brittle masking tape bore the faint shadow of my father's thumbprint. When I peeled the tape, it came away in a whisper and left the copper slightly tacky where his skin had touched it 1,000 times. I turned the key between my fingers the way I'd turned it the night he taught me to knit. Awkward at first, then steady, and lifted the lid. Velvet met my eyes. Deep, almost black, with small impressions where something round had rested for decades. 51 cushions, 51 tiny nests. Each watch lay wrapped like a promise, individually swaddled in felt or tissue, some with the faint scent of oil and something woody. Sawdust that smelled like the shop at the back of Dad's garage. He told me once, laughing, that jewelry smelled like its maker. He liked the idea that timepieces should carry the perfume of their restorers. Now the smell moved through me like a tide. I picked one without thinking. It was heavier than it looked, the bracelet worn soft at the links. When I tilted it under the lamp, the face caught the light, simple, elegant, and stamped Rolex beneath the crown. On the case back, etched so shallowly it looked like a secret, someone had engraved 1963, for the mill. My throat tightened. Instinctively I ran my thumb along the engraving and felt the tiny sharpness of the groove, as if a small hand had scored it. Dad had always liked to mark things by dates. The year a silo went up, the month they finished that claustrophobic downtown job, the day he first saw an offer he couldn't refuse. I set the Rolex down and unwrapped another. This one was buttery and exact, Patek Philippe in a slim, restrained case. It clicked with the smooth, confident whisper of a well-oiled mechanism when I gently nudged the crown. There was a tiny paper tag tucked beneath it with a number I recognized, an invoice stub from a rare parts dealer, the kind of place Dad used to favor when he wanted something that took time to find. A third watch, a bulkier Audemars Piguet, showed hairline scratches around its bezel where it had been handled in moments that mattered more than polishing. I could read those scratches like a biography. I opened my laptop and began to hunt, methodical, almost clinical at first. Model names, production years, auction results, forum threads where elderly collectors argued about patina versus perfection. Each search widened the room into history. I learned about reference numbers and serial ranges and the way supply and provenance inflated value. I learned that some of these brands in certain years and specific configurations could command prices nobody casually mentioned at holiday dinners. As I cross-referenced images and auction catalogs, sticky notes of tabs populated my browser window like a constellation. The lowest valuations I found for similar pieces hovered around $7,000. The rarer, expertly restored models in auction houses climbed toward $40,000. By the time I finished, by the time the kitchen light grew late and the city outside reduced to rusted stars, the sum sat in my head like a stunned animal. Nearly $500,000, tucked in cedar and velvet on my apartment floor. Money was the smallest ripple in the lake of feeling that expanded inside me. Even before the numbers, there was the intimate evidence of hands at work. Under a soft plastic divider at the bottom of the box lay a folded cloth with tiny flecks of polish stuck in its weave and a small handwritten index on yellowing paper. The handwriting was Dad's. His capital M looked like a building's roof, and beside each brand he'd scrawled a date and a line. Rolex, 1963, mill contract, signed. Patek, 1978, first big downtown job. Audemars, 1995, when we took the east site. Each watch was not only a luxury object, it was a ledger entry of a life's victories and costs. He had been bargaining with the world and marking the tallies on tiny round faces. As I traced the handwriting, a memory uncoiled. Dad hunched over the workbench under the garage's bare bulb, a magnifier clamped to his head like a crown. He taught me how to strip a tiny screw without losing its dignity, How to Listen for Balance by the Sound of a Rotor. In his stories, he personified the watches. This one slept through a winter storm in '82, he'd say, tapping the glass with a fingertip. He repaired them with the same fierce care he gave to a faulty beam or a crooked wall, meticulous, patient, with the certainty that small corrections mattered more than the show of strength. The watches were his private archive. He'd not merely collected them, he tended their wounds and named them by the moments they marked. I turned each piece over, noting fingerprints, tiny repairs where he'd replaced a spring or reloomed a hand. There were micro-solder marks on a caseback that showed where he purposely reinforced a lug. In the corner of the box, a damp patch held an oily smudge shaped like a comma, his smudge. That single imperfect mark felt more like conversation than the crisp corporate letters on the family's legal documents. There was no hurry now. The city's hum softened into a low, approving murmur. My fingers moved through inventory, checking dials, numbering the pieces for my own sanity, until the notebook beside me filled with scribbles. Brand, year, distinguishing marks, a loose estimate. I recorded serial numbers were visible, because a story anchored to facts felt less like bargaining and more like honoring what he'd left me. I photographed each watch with an old phone, the flash illuminating the patina and revealing engraved initials that had been almost hidden by age. When I finally rested, the box seemed less like a joke and more like a map, a carefully laid trail Dad had left for me to follow. He had given me, in velvet and brass and tick, the proof that he had watched my life as closely as he watched the seconds. Somewhere between the cold, shocking tally of worth and the warm, private ledger of purpose, a steadiness settled in my chest. The watches were worth fortunes, yes, but they were also a language he'd used when he couldn't otherwise say the word he wanted: pride. The phone felt foreign in my hand, heavy with possibility. When Tom Reynolds' name flashed on the screen, a small shock ran through me. He'd been my father's right hand for 2 decades, the practical mind that balanced Dad's instinct. I swallowed, wiped my palms on my jeans and answered. "Chelsea," Tom said, voice low and careful, like someone stepping around a sleeping dog. "I didn't want to bother you until you were ready." His tone softened something in me I hadn't known was raw. "Tom, thank you for calling. Is everything okay?" There was a pause, a rustle of paper. "Your father, he left me some notes, told me once, over a bad cup of diner coffee, that if anything happened, I shouldn't let the watches be auctioned without you knowing why he collected them. He said you'd understand." I felt the air leave my lungs and return thin. "Understand what?" Tom exhaled slowly. "Each watch, Chelsea, each one marks a moment in Parker Gilt's life. Every contract they won, every site they opened, the deals that kept the company breathing. He'd buy one when we closed something big or when a job taught him a lesson. He kept them like a ledger, not of money, but of time and consequence." I must have made a sound, because Tom cleared his throat. He told me, if anything happened, the person who understood time better than profit should have them. He said you kept time when others chased numbers. Tears came hot and unexpected, not the theatrical, cathartic kind, just a steady, undeniable tide. Dad had always been awkward with affection. He measured it in small things: a repaired watch, a sandwich packed for a late meeting, a note on the fridge that said call Tom at 9. To hear that he had trusted me in the quiet way he knew settled something that laughter and condescension had tried to rattle loose. "Tom," I said, trying to steady my voice, "why didn't he say that at the reading? Why make it a joke?" "He liked a puzzle," Tom replied, said it kept people honest. He didn't want things handed to anyone because they expected it. He wanted whoever took the watches to prove they'd do something meaningful with them. Meaningful. The word landed like a compass needle finding north. My chest unclenched and then tightened with resolve. For the first time since the lawyer's office, humiliation receded into the background, replaced by something more solid: purpose. I thought of the watches on my floor, 51 tiny, beating monuments to my father's life, and of the scrawled index in his handwriting that mapped each to a victory or a lesson. I thought of Ethan's sneer, Lydia's practiced amusement, the sterile tone of Mr. Walker announcing the house and the company like a business transaction. Dad hadn't wanted his life turned into a contest of ownership. He'd wanted stewardship. A plan took shape, not fully formed but sharp at the edges. I would sell half of the collection, carefully, reverently, to fund something Dad would have respected: a design and restoration studio. Not a boutique of flashy sales, but a workshop where timepieces and small things could be mended, where apprentices could learn to listen to mechanisms the way Dad had taught me to listen to beams. I would use the proceeds to lease a small space, buy tools, and hire at least one of Dad's old craftsmen who knew the language of gears and patience. There were practicalities to face. I would need appraisals, provenance documents, and careful sales channels. Some pieces would appreciate better through boutique auctions, others through private collectors who valued restoration history. I would have to consult an attorney about selling estate items. Tom had warned me about tax implications and trust conditions. I would need to be transparent to honor Dad's intention rather than liquidate his life for quick gain. I pictured the studio, workbenches worn smooth by use, magnifiers mounted on lamps, a wall lined with tools polished by hands that knew the weight of responsibility. A shelf would hold Dad's 3 favorites, not for value but for memory, watches I would never sell because they were his fingerprints in metal. Another shelf would display a small plaque, "Time mended here," for hands that build and hands that keep. I imagined teaching a kid how to remove a tiny screw without stripping it, showing clients that repair is a kind of respect. The studio would bridge my impulse to create and his insistence on utility. Still, a knot of doubt tightened. Ethan would expect more than a box, and some part of me feared his reaction if he learned I had turned something he'd mocked into a business that validated my choices. I'd also felt the weight of responsibility. To sell pieces with discretion, to ensure the buyers would honor the watch's history, and to keep clear records so nothing looked clandestine or opportunistic. Integrity mattered now, not as a slogan, but as a ledger of choices. I called Tom back within an hour. We spoke for a long time, inventorying the watches by brand and visible marks, discussing appraisers he trusted, and arranging for 2 of Dad's old foremen to meet me the next week. Tom promised to help with introductions to collectors he knew, and he said, carefully, that he'd support my plan as long as it honored what Michael Parker had intended. That night I made lists. Not fanciful daydreams but steps, appraisers to call, bids to seek, a spreadsheet of potential costs and projected revenues. I allocated half the watches for sale with precise notes beside each, why we could part with it, how to sell it, who might buy it. Beside the names of the pieces I vowed to keep, I wrote the word memory in my father's handwriting, as if to anchor the choice. A curious steadiness settled over me, less the wildfire indignation that had flared at the reading and more like a lamp lit from within. The watches were no longer a symbol of ridicule, they were instruments of possibility. Dad had not merely bequeathed objects, he had handed me a question: were we content to measure life by square footage in corporate reports, or could we honor the quieter arithmetic of time, the small, patient accumulations that make a life meaningful? I could feel, with granular clarity, why Dad had trusted me. Not because I painted or because I was different, but because I understood that time, like art and like a building, needs care. It needs someone willing to sit with it, to listen for the small misalignments and to fix them without fanfare. When I turned the page of my notebook and began to sketch the layout of the studio, the grief that shadowed my days thinned. The watches had become more than a tally, they were a roadmap. Tom's call had given me permission, practical and moral, to answer the puzzle my father had left. It was not vengeance against Ethan, nor a retreat into sentimentality. It was a deliberate, stubborn act of stewardship. To take what Dad had measured and make it count in a way he would finally approve. He arrived on a gray Thursday, the kind of day that makes city light look borrowed. I was bent over a sketchbook, tracing the layout for a workbench when a knock sounded at the door. 3 sharp raps, urgent but controlled. For a moment I thought it might be one of the foremen Tom had arranged to meet, or an appraiser, or a courier with a package of tiny screws. When I opened it, Ethan filled the doorway like a shadow stretched thin by distance. He wore the same suit as at the lawyer's office, though without the practiced ease. The jacket sagged at the shoulders as if someone had let wind out of it. "Chelsea," he said, and the name came soft, almost raw, as though he practiced a dozen different openings and this was the least offensive. "Ethan." I stepped aside. The apartment smelled faintly of oil and lemon polish, leftover from hours of handling tiny parts. And the open box on the floor behind me lifted its own private gravity into the room. He didn't look at it. He stood as if uncertain whether the space belonged to him. For years he had carried himself like a man who expected possession to be a natural right. Now he lingered on the threshold with something like apology in his posture. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I heard about the watches." I folded my hands and didn't rush to explain. The watches didn't need defense. They spoke for themselves, history and care pressed into metal. Yeah, I said eventually. They're beautiful, aren't they? He swallowed. A muscle jumped at his jaw. You knew? About the company? About how bad things have gotten? The question was more a confession than a forecast. Of course I knew, I said. Tom told me, the accounts were shaky. You didn't exactly hide it, just dressed it up with investors and optimism. My voice was level. I did not want to inflame. I wanted clarity. He had earned that, and perhaps he needed it more than he wanted to admit. Ethan's eyes darted away. For a breath he looked almost like the kid who used to climb the maple in our backyard and scrape his knees with pride. We could have used the money, he said. You could have given some of it back, helped keep things afloat. His hands were in his pockets. One thumb stroked the seam of the fabric like a metronome. Us, I repeated slow. You mean the company you mocked when it didn't give you immediate returns? You mean the company you told me to stop daydreaming and get a real job for? The sentence was sharper than I intended, but the years of small cuts had built a callus that sometimes sloughed off in the wrong place. He flinched at that, as if I'd touched an old bruise. I know I said things. He exhaled through his nose. But that was, look, Chelsea, I was trying to be practical. Dad built something that matters. I didn't want it to die because we were arguing about who deserved what. There was sincerity in his tone now, the kind that pricks the skin because it wasn't performative. He looked smaller in that moment, not less, but reduced to the human part of himself that worried, misstepped, and feared loss. He had always been good at pretending. He had learned from our father to wear competence like armor. Now that armor slicked with the sweat of worry. You laughed when the lawyer announced the box, I said. You made it a spectacle. My words weren't a judgment so much as a ledger, entries against years of behavior. I wanted him to see that his cruelty wasn't an accident, it was a habit. It felt like you were erasing him, me, by making a joke of the only thing he left me. Ethan's face contorted, not in anger but in something like shame. He took one unsteady step into the apartment, closing some of the distance. I laughed because it was the easiest response, he admitted. Laughing keeps people from asking questions. If you don't ask, you don't have to confront. But he stopped, pressed his palms flat against his thighs, and fumbled for a steadier phrase. I'm not proud of how I acted. I wasn't thinking about meaning. I was thinking about payroll and lawyers and the kind of disasters you believe can be fixed with money. That last admission landed with a dull weight. For a moment the two of us held a private conference of memories. Dad at the kitchen table late at night, balancing invoices. Dad in the truck after a site visit, hands smelling of tar and effort. The small secret counsel he'd given me about care and craft. Ethan's worry had been pragmatic, but so narrow it had erased the possibility that legacy could be something other than corporate continuity. You could have asked, I said. You could have come to talk to me, not to demand, about a plan. Dad didn't put you in charge of everything because he loved spreadsheets. He trusted people who made the hard choices thoughtfully. Ethan's mouth tightened. I thought I'd be given the company to manage, he said. I thought by default, I'd be the one who carried the burden. There it was. Entitlement tangled with fear. His father's praise had been handed to him like a baton, and the fear of dropping it had made him desperate enough to justify anything. I didn't take the watches to spite you, I said. I took them because Tom told me what they meant, and because I felt responsible for making them count for something that honored Dad. Selling some, starting a workshop. This isn't about punishment. It's about stewardship. His shoulders slumped as if something tangible had been taken from him. So you really mean it? You'll start the studio? The question had the tone of someone trying to confirm a rumor and finding it true. You won't sell the lot and hand me a check? No, the answer was short and exact. I won't sell the lot. Some pieces I'll keep. Some I'll sell, carefully, to fund the studio. But I won't let them be liquidated into debts that erase the history they mark. I watched his face as I spoke. The expression that crossed it was a complicated shoreline. Loss, understanding, and a slow recognition of finality. Ethan turned away, then back, as if searching for the shape of a conversation that could still save something. I'm sorry, he said finally. It wasn't the theatrical apology he'd offered at graduations or boardrooms. It trembled with authenticity. For laughing, for not being there for him, for assuming. I listened. The apology felt like a key, small, ordinary, but the sound it made in the lock was distinct. I didn't fling myself into forgiveness. That was a luxury neither of us had earned. but I felt the edge of something that could be built on. Not an instant repair, but the start of an honest blueprint. "You can help," I said. "If you want to make good, then help me set up the studio. Use what you know, your people, your logistics. We'll be accountable. No more assumptions. No more mockery." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. Then he nodded slowly with the awkwardness of a man learning new muscle memory. "I'll help," he answered. "Not because I expect gratitude, because Dad would have wanted someone to keep the work honest." And he hesitated, voice thinning. "And because I don't want to be the person who laughs at what mattered." We stood in that small apartment between the box and the sketchbook, a brittle truce forming like solder cooling on a seam. The confrontation had not resolved everything. The ledger of our family still had missing entries, and the company's fate still hung elsewhere, but the rawness had shifted into something workable. For the first time since the reading, the conversation felt less like an accusation and more like the laying of foundation, uneven, imperfect, but necessary if anything significant was to rise. The months following the confrontation unfolded like a careful, deliberate watch mechanism, each gear turning with precision, each tick measured and meaningful. My studio, Parker Timepieces, became more than just a business. It became a living chronicle of my father's philosophy, a space where craft and sentiment intertwined. I spent mornings meticulously restoring antique watches, opening each casing to reveal the inner harmony of gears, springs, and tiny screws that danced in perfect synchronicity. Each movement felt like a heartbeat, a fragment of someone else's story preserved in metal and glass. The studio smelled faintly of cedar and oil, a comforting combination that reminded me of Dad's workshop long before his empire had grown. I designed custom pieces for clients, blending artistry with precision engineering, but the heart of the studio was the collection Dad had left me. I had chosen one to display under glass, a Patek Philippe he'd cherished, engraved with a date marking the first big contract of Parker built incorporated the label "Reed," for the man who taught me to value time. I didn't need it to impress anyone. It was a tribute, a quiet acknowledgement that the wisdom he had imparted was my inheritance as much as the watches themselves. Visitors would pause in front of it, their reflections merging with the golden sheen of the dial, and I would feel Dad's presence, not as a ghost, but as a guiding hand shaping the values I carried forward. The studio grew steadily. Local collectors came for restoration, young designers sought mentorship, and even investors approached with interest in partnerships that respected the spirit of what I was building. It was a quiet success, one measured not by the flash of wealth, but by the substance of work well done. Late at night, when the city outside was muted and the ticking of the watches was the only sound, I felt a profound satisfaction that had nothing to do with material reward. Every watch I restored was a small victory, a tangible proof that legacy could be crafted carefully, lovingly, and deliberately. One afternoon, a knock on the door interrupted my routine. I opened it to see Mr. Langford, our family lawyer, standing there with a familiar, warm smile. He stepped inside, removing his gloves with a slow, deliberate motion, and gestured toward the display case. "I thought you'd like to know," he said. "Your father had one more clause in his will. If either child demonstrated integrity and purpose with their inheritance within the first year, they'd receive an additional trust." I blinked, a flush of surprise warming my cheeks. "Additional trust?" I asked, trying to mask the disbelief in my tone. "Yes," he said, handing me a small folder. "Your father believed that stewardship, not entitlement, was the true measure of worth. He tracked your progress through Tom and his letters to me. It seems he was very pleased with your approach." I left the folder unopened for a moment, letting the words settle. Months of careful work, patience, and quiet focus had been recognized, not with applause, not with a headline, but with an act that reflected Dad's values. Finally, I opened it. The transfer had been made, $1.2 million. I felt a mixture of awe and warmth, a reassurance that the choices I had made honored the man who had taught me so much. Ethan, I knew, had not received a penny from this part of the trust, not because Dad had punished him, but because he had chosen differently, or failed to choose at all. I did not gloat. I did not feel triumph in the shallow sense. What I felt was alignment, as though I had passed a subtle test, invisible to everyone except the person who mattered most. In the quiet of the studio that evening, I traced my fingers over the polished cases of the watches. Each tick echoed like a memory, a whisper from the past. I thought about Dad and Ethan and the lessons we each had taken or ignored. Wealth, I realized, had never been the point. Houses, companies, even the $500,000 collection were not merely assets. They were tools, symbols, conduits of the deeper inheritance Dad had left: discernment, integrity, and the ability to value meaning over mere acquisition. The sun dipped low and golden light spilled across the benches, catching the dials in fleeting brilliance. I adjusted the display so the light hit just right, highlighting the engravings, the tiny imperfections that spoke to history and care. I thought about how easy it would have been to follow the path of entitlement, to see the watches merely as currency, but I had chosen differently. That choice, guided by Dad's quiet wisdom, had led to more than money. It had led to purpose, a studio that bore his name in spirit, and a future that felt solid, intentional, and alive. I leaned back, taking in the room, the scent of wood polish, the hum of precision machines, the gleaming rows of watches, each a story. Somewhere deep down, I understood Dad's greatest lesson. Legacy was not in the walls you built, the titles you held, or the currency you amassed. It was in the understanding of what truly matters, the recognition of the moments that tick away unnoticed, and the choices you make when no one is watching. Time, in all its relentless passage, was the ultimate measure, and I, finally, irrevocably, had learned to honor it. For the first time since Dad's passing, I felt the weight of inheritance settle not as a burden but as a gift, luminous and precise, a continuum of love, trust, and purpose that stretched across generations. I smiled quietly, knowing that in my hands the future would keep ticking exactly as it should.